Deciding to check on her husband, she said she had refused the inheritance. Then she overheard his conversation with his mistress about the will. Megan Barton deliberately got out of the taxi at the embankment. On business trips, she almost never used her husband's car. It was safer that way. After all, anything could happen on the highway, and she couldn't even change a tire herself. And Charles was constantly complaining that Megan's driving would inevitably ruin the suspension of his baby. It was about a half-hour walk from the embankment to home. The day was drawing to a close, and the sun had lost its daytime strength. Megan's mood had noticeably improved. After all, she had just returned from a grueling business trip. And then there was this inheritance from a distant relative, Oscar Woods. But, as they say, it would be a sin to refuse such a thing. A small oil mill in the suburbs and a stable with outbuildings nearby. A dream come true. Megan was pulled out of her anxious thoughts by the ring of her cell phone, which was lying in her bag. Picking up the phone, she smiled. "Hi, son." On the other end of the line came the joyful sound of breathing. "Mom, hi. Are you coming home soon? I miss you." Megan smiled but decided not to reveal the secret of her return. "Maybe another day. Are you bored with Dad? What are you two up to?" Eric hesitated a little and then said, "Actually, I'm at Grandma's now. Been here for 3 days. And Dad is always at work, you know." Megan frowned. Her son was at her mother-in-law's. What could be keeping Charles so busy? Although, he had mentioned problems with the business. Said it was sinking like a stricken submarine. "Well, don't be upset, sweetie. I'll be home soon. Hang in there a bit longer. And say hi to Darlene Johnson," Megan replied, trying to keep her voice natural. But her heart was troubled. She hadn't told anyone about her arrival. She decided to surprise her husband. Moreover, Megan wanted to check her husband's reaction to the news that she wanted to refuse the inheritance from her late uncle. "How can you refuse? What about my business? That oil mill and stable must be worth a lot of money." "Well, maybe not a lot, but still. In my situation, every penny counts," Charles had said indignantly during their last phone call. Megan smiled but didn't break the suspense. "We'll manage somehow. I've only seen this Oscar twice in my life. So, I don't need his inheritance at all. Besides, I have a cousin, Michael. He has cerebral palsy, but I think he's more deserving." Charles nearly choked in surprise. "Are you crazy? How can you let that kind of money slip through your fingers? This is our only chance. Please, think it over. Don't be hasty. And that invalid, he probably gets a pension. So, he'll be fine." But Megan was adamant. The conversation didn't go well, to say the least. But she wasn't upset, because it was all initially intended as a light deception, a joke, and a test of feelings. Sometimes a reset is necessary in family life. Megan's best friend, Helen Hicks, had taught her that. Helen had suggested giving Charles a bit of a shake-up so he would finally get moving and start solving his problems like a man. But this didn't mean Megan was carrying the family alone. It was just that lately, Charles had been slacking off. And his business was going downhill. However, calling his small construction firm a business was a bit of an overstatement. Just give him a little test. Show up from your business trip a day or two early. Say, "You didn't expect us, but we're back." And shock him with something. You know, to throw him off balance, Helen had advised with a smile. Megan initially refused the idea, but then decided to try it. Working as a procurement manager for medical equipment, she was often on business trips, visiting various factories and pharmaceutical companies. Judging by Charles's reaction to the news of the inheritance refusal, she had hit the nail on the head. "Well, I'll just go to the store, buy some wine, fruits, and something tasty." A romantic dinner always brings people closer, Megan thought on her way to the store. Looking at the calm surface of the river, reflecting the sunset, she felt all her tension melt away, dissolving into the evening air. Megan smiled to herself and enjoyed the coolness coming from the water. The air was filled with the scent of moisture mixed with a faint aroma of flowers from the flower beds lining the embankment. Having bought wine, fruits, and a small cake, she quickened her pace. Charles would see her now, hug her, and she would tell him the important news. There was their cozy house. They had bought it 4 years ago with the money Megan had saved up over several years. But now, for some reason, the front door was open, though the lights were on inside. Megan took a deep breath to greet her husband when she heard voices. A man's voice, belonging to her husband, and a woman's voice, which she didn't recognize. So, what do we do now? What if that fool really refuses the inheritance? How will we save your business? Asked the unfamiliar woman. Megan shuddered. Good Lord, who is this? And how does she know about the inheritance? Oh, come on, Sherry. We'll figure it out. I'll persuade her. I don't need that oil mill and stable. But if we sell that plot for development, we can make a huge profit, replied Charles, and then added, in any case, Megan needs to be convinced to accept the inheritance, and then if we divorce, I might get a piece of it. Her husband's words shocked her to the core. Still clutching the bags with groceries and wine, Megan pondered what to do next. Meanwhile, the stranger sang in an angelic voice. Don't be sad, Charles. Come to me, I'll comfort you. And your Megan won't go anywhere. She's just acting up. Showing her temper. Like, look at this stubborn mare. The words made Megan flush with anger. A mare? What does this little upstart think she's doing? Maybe she should storm into the house and cause a scene? A big one, with dishes breaking and suitcases being packed. Although she didn't plan on packing her own suitcases. Let Charles get out with his sherry and bankrupt construction company. She had already grabbed the door handle when she suddenly changed her mind and froze on the porch with the bag in her hands. At that moment, Megan decided not to force the issue and simply leave without a scene. The thing was, after a long trip, she simply didn't have the strength for a showdown. More than anything, she feared that if she entered the living room now, she would just break down in tears, much to the delight of her unfaithful husband and his mistress. No, she couldn't allow that. Revenge is a dish best served cold. So, let them have their fun. Let them bask in each other's arms. Pouting her lips bitterly, Megan placed the bag with groceries and wine on the porch and walked away, still not understanding what exactly had happened that evening. How could Charles do this to her? Maybe she should go back? Fight him? Show him that she wouldn't allow herself to be hurt. But the initial anger had already faded, replaced by the sadness of what she had heard. Not knowing where to go next, Megan headed to her mother-in-law Darlene's house, where her son was staying. It was a pity, really, that the nice surprise for Eric had fallen through. The evening was quiet. Now Megan had to retrace her steps along the same route she had taken earlier. The embankment again, the smell of moisture in the air. Opposite, on the other bank of the river, tall buildings rose, illuminated by the golden twilight. Above, the lights of cars, sliding through the night city like fireflies, were visible. The sound of the waves gently splashing at the shore reminded her of how much time had passed since she last saw such tranquility. It used to seem that this sound would lift the weight of her worries, allowing her to relax, to sink into serenity. But now that was out of the question. What serenity and tranquility could there be when Charles had betrayed her, trading her for some cheap doll? And what did he say about the will? Why does he need it? How is it related to Charles? Megan thought on her way to her mother-in-law's house. Darlene opened the door immediately, as if she had been expecting her visit all along. Megan, why didn't you call ahead? It's late. Eric has been asleep for a while, she asked with surprise. Megan smiled awkwardly, thinking of what to say to her mother-in-law to make it sound plausible. Well, Darlene, I managed to finish up earlier, so I came straight to see Eric. Her mother-in-law looked at her suspiciously but didn't voice her thoughts. Instead, she invited her daughter-in-law to the kitchen, where she poured a cup of tea and offered some fresh homemade pastries. At that moment, Megan suddenly felt a strong urge to pour out her heart. Her own mother had died 10 years ago. She never knew her father. However, Megan's relationship with her mother-in-law couldn't be called good. But they weren't enemies either. Megan communicated with Darlene rather dryly. She never shared her secrets with her. They talked about this and that occasionally. That was all. In Megan's opinion, it was all due to stereotypes about how a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law should treat each other. Darlene also didn't meddle in her affairs and very rarely tried to get Megan to open up. She was happy just to see her grandson and play games like hide and seek and guess the word. That was enough for her. The dimly flickering light of the lamp softly illuminated the cozy kitchen, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Megan held herself together for about half an hour, talking to her mother-in-law about everything and nothing. But then, unable to bear the burden that had fallen on her, she covered her face with her hands, and her fragile shoulders shook with silent sobs. "Megan, what's wrong? Are you feeling ill?" Darlene asked with concern, but Megan just shook her head sorrowfully. It took her a while to muster up the courage to open up. Only after crying a little did she quietly manage to say, "How could he, Darlene? I have always been a good wife to Charles. I always took care of him, and he betrayed me, took a mistress." "Don't cry, my dear," Darlene comforted her, gently stroking her hair. "It will get better, you'll see. It's just our lot as women." Megan sobbed and pulled away from her mother-in-law, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. At that moment, her eyes looked at Darlene with indescribable pain and confusion. Her expression darkened. In truth, Darlene didn't know how to react to her daughter-in-law's confession. After all, her son Charles had never seemed to her to be the ideal of a faithful and reliable man. On the other hand, she understood that her daughter-in-law wouldn't just suspect Charles of infidelity without reason. "I want a divorce," Megan said firmly. "I can't live with him anymore, knowing he's cheating on me and lying at every step." "But Megan, think it over again," Darlene pleaded. "Divorce is such a serious decision. Maybe you should wait a little?" "No, I've made up my mind," Megan replied, rising from her chair. "I'll hire a lawyer and file for divorce. Probably next week." With that, she went to the guest room and closed the door behind her, leaving Darlene in confusion and worry. Deep in her heart, it pained the mother to realize that her son's and daughter-in-law's marriage was falling apart. After a moment's thought, Darlene left the kitchen and quietly opened the guest room door. "Megan, I need to tell you something," she began. "It's about Charles and his whole life." Megan shrugged indifferently, then followed her mother-in-law to the living room and sat down opposite her. Her face showed confusion and curiosity. Fortunately, her little son was already asleep and didn't see her tear-stained eyes. "I'm not Charles's biological mother," Darlene began. "I found him as a baby 27 years ago." Megan was stunned. She had never imagined that Charles wasn't Darlene's biological son. Tears glistened in the corners of her mother-in-law's eyes as memories of long-gone years surfaced. On that rainy autumn day, she was returning from the cemetery where she had just buried her husband, who had died in a car accident. Darlene's heart was shattered into hundreds of sharp pieces, and the future seemed uncertain and frightening. She was only 43 then, with her whole life ahead of her, yet already a widow. And childless. Passing by someone's grave, Darlene suddenly saw a tiny, bundled blanket. Startled, she froze in place. The bundle was moving and making strange noises. Did someone abandon a kitten or a puppy, she wondered. Approaching closer, Darlene was astonished to find a newborn baby inside. The baby was crying, and its tiny arms and legs looked so miniature, like those of a doll. Darlene looked around, then carefully picked up the child and held it close to her chest. Her heart was pounding wildly. At that moment, she knew she couldn't leave the baby to its fate. Wrapping the infant in her shawl, Darlene took him home. The first few months with little Charles were tough. Darlene had neither milk nor money for a nanny, but she never complained. She fed the boy cow's milk diluted with formula. When Charles turned 1, Darlene obtained guardianship and officially adopted him. She gave Charles her late husband's surname and loved him as her own son. All these years, Darlene never revealed how she found him. She feared that if the boy had any relatives, they might take him away, which would annul the adoption. But now, with Charles grown and having his own family, Darlene suddenly felt the need to share her secret. She hoped that this revelation might somehow help save her son's marriage. But how is that possible? Megan whispered. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Darlene sighed sadly. I was afraid you might tell Charles, and he would be upset and want to find his real parents. You see, I didn't want to lose him. But he has a right to know the truth, Megan argued. Yes, of course, he does, Darlene agreed. I think I should have told him earlier. I'm afraid this might destroy his family. Megan shook her head. No, Darlene, your son ruined his marriage long before. When he took a mistress, he betrayed not only me but also his son. Darlene pursed her lips and turned to the window. Megan sat silently, processing the news. Hundreds of thoughts raced through her mind. I understand this is a shock for you, Darlene finally said, but please, don't tell Charles right now. Give me some time. I'll prepare him. Megan nodded, still unsure of what to do. I promise I won't tell him, she said, but I want you to tell him as soon as possible. And as for me, I'm still going to file for divorce. Darlene nodded in agreement and went to the kitchen to make some tea. Megan stayed in the living room. At that moment, her heart was filled with mixed emotions, shock, surprise, and sadness. She always knew that her mother-in-law was, in principle, a good woman. But she never thought Darlene was capable of such a selfless act. Adopting Charles, knowing he wasn't her biological child, and raising him with love and care. Megan left the living room and approached the window. She looked at the street, illuminated by streetlights, which seemed magical. The world continued to turn, but for Megan, everything had changed in an instant. She would never look at Charles the same way again. Now she knew that there could be nothing more between them. Megan sighed sadly and went to the kitchen, where a cup of fragrant tea awaited her. She didn't feel like sleeping. How could she sleep when one shocking news was replaced by another? That evening, she and Darlene stayed up late. Darlene took out the family album and showed Megan Charles's school photos. He looked at the world with childlike innocence. However, these photos didn't particularly impress Megan. She knew very well that children could be adorable angels, but as adults, they could become unbearable. Eventually, tired of talking, Megan went to bed, but not before carefully looking into the room where Eric was sleeping. The boy was sleeping soundly, clutching a teddy bear to his chest. At that moment, Megan suddenly wanted to go back to the past. She wanted to be a child again, so her parents could solve all her problems while she focused on school, embroidery, or reading books. However, the thought of childhood brought back painful memories. In school, Megan Barton was often teased with unkind epithets. The most hurtful nickname was Scarecrow, which stuck to her by accident when she wore an old wide-brimmed hat to school. She thought it would amuse and please her friends, but the effect was quite the opposite. The hat resembled one worn by a scarecrow in a cornfield near the school. Growing up in a village, Megan didn't worry about such things. However, because of the hat's resemblance to the scarecrows, she was branded with the nickname Scarecrow. If little Megan had known this would happen, she would never have worn that hat. Instead, she faced what we now call bullying, a term that was unheard of back then. Often, on her way home, Megan would stop in the park to cry. The teasing from her classmates became increasingly cruel, leading Megan to view herself as a scarecrow. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she would deliberately seek out flaws to explain the negative attention from her peers. This was a mistake her grandmother repeatedly pointed out. Megan, you can't be so hard on yourself. Believe me, almost everyone has flaws. One day, "You'll be very beautiful, and boys will flock to you," Florence Austin would say. Megan would nod in agreement and promise herself to stand up for herself. But each new day brought new problems related to her classmates' mockery. Megan truly learned to withstand adversity only by graduation, when she took a different path and became a straight-A student. By winning various academic competitions and contests, she was constantly in the spotlight, which didn't match her nickname Scarecrow or Fright. For Megan, this was akin to a small victory. Many life challenges awaited her, but she won her first battle with life's adversities during her school years. Next came university studies and her diploma upon graduation. Of course, memories of her peers' taunts remained deeply buried in the past, but they occasionally resurfaced like a phoenix rising from the ashes. Most often, scenes from her childhood came in dreams, where Megan again felt like a little girl clutching an old-fashioned hat to her chest. As she settled down to sleep at her mother-in-law's house, she sincerely hoped that tonight would be different. Meanwhile, Sherry, Charles's mistress, decided to get some fresh air, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. Seeing bags of wine and groceries at her feet, she exclaimed in surprise, "Charles, someone left us a present. Can you believe it? There's a cake, wine, and even candles. Is today Valentine's Day?" "No, that's in February." "Not that I care about those holidays," Charles grumbled and stepped over the threshold. Looking through the groceries, he noticed a receipt from a nearby supermarket at the bottom of the bag. Seeing whose bank card had paid for the purchase, he frowned. Well, Megan bought all this. And it's her favorite cake. See? Sherry pouted. "And why would I want her cake? I'm watching my figure, unlike your cow. If you eat cakes at night, you won't fit into any blouse." Charles shrugged. At that moment, he was worried about something else entirely. If Megan had left the groceries on the porch, she might have known he wasn't alone in the house, meaning she had returned from her trip early. But why? What if she overheard their conversation about the inheritance and the will? Damn, what a blunder. After thinking for a while, Charles shrugged it off and uncorked the wine. "Well, we might as well enjoy it. If we're going down, let's go down in style." Though Charles had no intention of going down. He just said it for effect. In reality, he was planning a very clever scheme, but he needed a large sum of money to pull it off. He wanted to impress, rent an expensive office, hire a team of highly skilled workers, and present himself to foreign investors as someone in full control. Like he had everything under control and orders were flooding in. "Listen, darling, what will we do if we can't take the inheritance from your wife?" Sherry asked, taking a sip of wine and eagerly biting into the very cake she had just criticized harshly. Charles downed half his glass and then said, "Well, I've already thought about that, Sherry. I'll mortgage my mother's apartment at the bank. It's a 2-bedroom in a residential area. They'll pay good money for it." Sherry looked at her boyfriend in bewilderment. "And where will your mother live then? Don't think you can bring her into our house." At the word "our," Charles winced, knowing that the house was partly bought with Megan's money. However, he didn't want to dwell on that and quickly answered Sherry's question. "I'll send her to a nursing home. You know, one of those retirement homes. Let her stay there for a while, and we'll see what happens next." Sherry nearly choked on her wine in astonishment. Charles really was a schemer. He was planning to put his own mother in a nursing home. It was unthinkable. And for what? For some lucrative deal with foreign investors, which was still very uncertain. Sherry took another sip of wine and indulged in more cake. Megan had good taste, no doubt about it. The cake was delicious. Sherry's mood improved noticeably, especially when she realized that after the divorce, she and Charles would live together. However, Charles himself felt uneasy. His main concern was that Megan had found out about his affair with Sherry earlier than planned. What if she goes to a lawyer? What if she takes the house from me? And there's her inheritance, too. Although she said she refused it. Fool, really a fool, Charles thought as he lay in bed. Sherry was already sound asleep with a clear conscience. But Charles couldn't find peace. "All right, I'll think of something." It's not the first time, he thought and closed his eyes. In the morning, Megan woke up feeling worn out. Her head ached, and her body felt sore as if after an intense workout. Opening her eyes, she immediately saw her son's cheerful face. Smiling mysteriously, Eric was holding a tray with cookies slathered with butter, arranged like miniature cakes. "Mom, wake up. I made you breakfast." "Grandma's not feeling well," he said. "Thank you, son." "What's wrong with Grandma?" she asked anxiously. Eric shrugged uncertainly. "I don't know, Mom." As soon as Grandma woke up, she went straight to the medicine cabinet. I saw through the crack. She took 2 or 3 pills at once. Megan's heart began to beat anxiously. Getting out of bed, she approached the door leading to the bedroom. "Darlene, can I come in?" At first, there was a tense silence. Then she heard a soft female voice, "Come in, Megan. I'm not feeling well. I've had chest pain since morning. I took some medicine, but it hasn't helped." Megan entered the room and immediately noticed the distinct smell of valerian and something similar. "Maybe we should call a doctor, Darlene?" "No, no need. It will pass. I just need some rest. I must have gotten too nervous yesterday, and my heart is acting up," Darlene responded. Megan suddenly felt an inexplicable worry. Her own mother, Monica Barton, had complained of chest pain and slight shortness of breath just like this. And just like Darlene, she had refused medical help. Megan had regretted not insisting on hospitalization, not calling the doctor, and believing her mother's reassurances that she would feel better soon. But it didn't get better. It got worse, so much worse that the doctors couldn't help in the end. If only anyone knew how many times she had gone to the cemetery, kneeling by her mother's grave, asking for forgiveness, caressing the grave mound as if it were a living person, mourning and crying uncontrollably. Even the elderly caretaker would avoid her, understanding her pain. Faced with a similar situation now, Megan decided not to take any chances and reached for the phone. But she didn't get the chance to call an ambulance for her mother-in-law. Just a second earlier, her husband called. "Megan, what is going on? And what's the deal with the cake and wine on the porch?" Charles demanded. Megan was so outraged she couldn't breathe. "And you have the nerve to bring this up? You should be ashamed. If not for me, then at least for your mother." "Why should I be ashamed? Wait, are you at her place now? Does she know what happened?" Charles snapped. Translation: knows, and knows very well. And as for us with Eric, you can forget about us. We're no longer family to you. I'm filing for divorce. You can continue enjoying yourself with your Sherry, Megan said in anger and abruptly ended the call. At that moment, Eric rushed into the room, looking frightened. Mom, Grandma isn't feeling well." A wave of icy shivers ran down Megan's spine. "Oh God, no, not this." Hurrying to Darlene, who had slumped, Megan immediately tried to feel for a pulse. Fortunately, it was there, albeit very weak. Megan reacted almost instantly and called for an ambulance. She then sat beside Darlene and began to dab her mother-in-law's face with cool water. Darlene's hand twitched as she opened her eyes slightly and whispered softly, "Thank you, dear. I'm sorry it turned out this way." "Oh, Darlene, it's not your fault. Just hang in there, the doctors will be here soon." The elderly woman forced a smile through her pain. "She won't make it in time. Megan, a fortune teller, predicted in my youth that I would leave at 70. So, you can't go against fate." Megan shook her head, anxiously checking the time. "Oh God, where's that ambulance?" "Darlene, don't think about the worst. Everything will be fine. The doctors will arrive soon and give you an injection," Megan pleaded. Soon, there was a long-awaited knock at the door, and 6-year-old Eric ran to open it. Megan breathed a sigh of relief. Indeed, there were people in white coats at the door. One of them winked at her son and smiled subtly. Then the doctor began the examination. He took out a stethoscope while the paramedic started measuring blood pressure. Megan sat beside the bed, anxiously twirling a handkerchief embroidered with intricate flowers by her mother-in-law's hands. Darlene lay there, clutching her chest, grimacing in pain. Meanwhile, Megan's mother-in-law slowly described her episode. She complained to the doctor about severe crushing chest pains, accompanied by shortness of breath and cold sweats. The doctor listened attentively, asking clarifying questions as he went along. By the end of the examination, the doctor's face became solemn. "Darlene, I advise you to come with us to the hospital," he said. "The symptoms clearly indicate a heart problem, so I want you to be examined more thoroughly, but within the clinic's walls." She shook her head in refusal. "No, doctor," she protested, "I just need some rest, and I'll be fine again." Megan frowned. She knew her mother-in-law was stubborn and disliked hospitals, but she also knew the doctor was right. Darlene's health condition was indeed too unstable to risk it. "Darlene," she intervened, "the doctor knows what he's doing. You need to go to the hospital for your own good." Darlene hesitated for a moment, then with a heavy sigh, finally relented. "Okay," she said, "I'll go." The doctor nodded, and Megan helped Darlene change clothes. Then they, along with the paramedic, escorted her out of the apartment and towards the ambulance. Since it wasn't possible to leave an elderly patient alone, the doctor asked Megan to accompany her to the department. "Mom, don't worry, go. I'll sit quietly and watch cartoons," Eric decided, trying to reassure her. Megan looked at her son with doubt. Truth be told, she didn't want to leave the little one alone at home. Deciding to call Charles about it, Megan encountered a new problem when the indifferent voice of the cell phone operator informed her that the subscriber was out of reach. "Well, there you go. As always, I'm the one who needs it the most," Megan said resentfully. However, she didn't have any other choice. She couldn't abandon her mother-in-law in such a difficult situation, especially since Darlene was not to blame for her adoptive son cheating on his fiancée. Brushing aside her concerns, Megan followed the doctors. In the ambulance, Darlene held her hand the whole time. "Forgive me," she whispered, "I really didn't want to cause you trouble." "It's okay," Megan reassured her, "the most important thing is for you to feel better." The journey to the hospital was short, but for Megan, time seemed to stretch painfully long. She pondered what could have happened if Dr. Vincent Bailey hadn't insisted on hospitalization. In the emergency department, Darlene was promptly greeted by the attending physician and a team of nurses. Soon, the elderly patient was assigned to a ward, where she was connected to monitors tracking her heart rate, pulse, and blood oxygen level. Throughout this time, Megan sat nearby on a chair in the waiting area, watching as the nurses administered medications to her mother-in-law and updated her medical history at the reception desk. After some time, the emergency doctor, Vincent, returned and confidentially announced, "With your mother-in-law, everything will be fine. The preliminary examination results indicate that she most likely has unstable angina caused by coronary artery blockage. But I'm confident her condition will stabilize. The attending physician has already prescribed a course of medication to monitor her condition." Megan looked at him with gratitude. Vincent was indeed a good man, calm and reliable as a rock. Not like her hysterical husband, Charles, who couldn't solve a single problem on his own. On the way back, Megan decided not to call a taxi or use public transportation. She wanted to clear her mind and refresh her thoughts, as so much had happened in the last 24 hours that her head was spinning. Deciding to take a shortcut through her mother-in-law's neighborhood, Megan walked through the park. At this time of year, it was particularly beautiful, blooming linden trees, flower beds with roses and peonies, and a small pond where wild ducks swam, so accustomed to humans that they were willing to eat from their hands. Megan, in a light summer dress, strolled leisurely along the park path, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere and coolness after the stuffy hospital corridor. At that moment, her phone rang invitingly from her purse. "Well, there we go. Has Charles finally come to his senses?" His mother is in the hospital, and he's goodness knows where, thought Megan, but upon answering the call, she realized it was her boss, Anthony Brown. Megan, where have you disappeared to? I heard you returned from the business trip yesterday. Why haven't you submitted your report yet? Why haven't you called me? The businessman asked challengingly. Sorry, Anthony, I just had a problem arise here. You see, my mother-in-law was admitted to the hospital with a heart condition. I had to help out, Megan stammered. Her boss snorted irritably. Mother-in-law, you say, fell ill. Well, that's quite something. Okay, sort out your problems and get to me with that report as soon as possible. Okay, Anthony. I will, definitely, Megan replied immediately, feeling relieved that she managed to brush it off so easily. She couldn't afford to lose her job on top of everything else that had happened. Putting her phone back in her purse, she continued walking. Suddenly, from the direction of the nearest bushes, a young man appeared, dressed in worn-out jeans and a faded t-shirt. He was walking unsteadily, stumbling, trying to maintain his balance using a chestnut tree trunk he leaned on. His face seemed flushed, his eyes unfocused, and his speech slurred and confused. Taking a closer look at the stranger, Megan immediately realized the man was severely intoxicated. At that moment, she deliberately slowed her pace, watching as the young man, unaware of anyone around, continued on his way. In an instant, he stumbled, lost his balance, and fell onto the cobblestone path. Megan rushed to help him up. Are you okay? Do you need help? The man slowly raised his head. His gaze was wandering, as if he were drowning in the depths of his own illusions. Yeah. I'm not feeling well, he mumbled, trying to get up. His attempt was unsuccessful, and the stranger lost his balance again. It took Megan a great effort to support him and prevent him from falling onto the road a second time. What was this young alcoholic doing here at all? Truth be told, Megan didn't want to spend her time on him right now, especially after she had just ridden with her sick mother-in-law in the ambulance. Where are you going? She asked the vagabond, trying to keep him upright. Home, I'm going home, he slurred, clinging to her hand. Megan surveyed the surroundings. Young couples were sitting on benches, children were running along the paths. Overall, everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves, and only this drunk stranger looked completely out of place in the cozy and warm world. What's your name? Megan asked, gathering her courage. Carlos, he replied with difficulty. Carlos, you need to sit down. You're too drunk. Look, there's a pond. You might fall into the water, Megan pointed out, and to confirm her words, she pointed to a small pond located a few meters away from them. Carlos looked at the dark water, the surface of which elegantly reflected the sun's rays. Oh, it's really beautiful, he murmured, gazing at the water. Yes, very, Megan agreed. Carlos, I can't leave you alone. Let me help you get home. He sighed discontentedly and grimaced from a severe headache. No, there's no need. I don't even remember where home is. Megan shook her head and led him towards the park exit. She didn't know what to do with him, just as she didn't know how to help him. Carlos didn't resist. He walked with difficulty, desperately trying to maintain his balance. Finally, when the man was completely exhausted, Megan helped him sit on a bench. She looked around. There was a public transport stop nearby. Megan sighed. Her patience was wearing thin with each passing minute. She could already imagine explaining to her son why she was so late. Deciding to leave Carlos on the bench, Megan tried to stand up, but the vagabond didn't let her. Please, don't leave, Carlos whispered, grabbing her hand. I need your help. Megan sharply pulled her hand away. I'm sorry, I have to go. I have my own things to take care of, besides everything else. But looking into Carlos's eyes, she realized she couldn't just leave him. Truth be told, Megan was completely at a loss. She had never been in such a situation before. At some point, she just wanted to leave this man and go wherever her eyes took her. Let him sit on the bench and sober up. But something about Carlos's behavior clearly didn't fit with alcohol intoxication. He seemed drunk and yet not. And there was no smell of alcohol either. Maybe it was his behavior that was unsettling, or perhaps his way of speaking. Homeless people usually behave a bit differently, though Megan didn't consider herself an expert in this area. After thinking for a while, she tried to lift the man again, who was weakening before her eyes. Fortunately, at that moment, a janitor appeared from the bushes, a strong elderly man in a blue uniform. Seeing Megan, he approached and shook his head. "Oh, bother. Looks like another homeless person got completely wasted again," he muttered. "It's the same story every time. And what happened to him?" "He'll be okay, won't he?" Megan asked, expressing her concern. "It's hard to say," the janitor replied. "Depends on what he drank and how much. Sometimes these people really get in bad shape, and then they need help." Megan looked at the man with dismay. "And what should we do with him? We can't just leave him here in this condition, can we?" The janitor sighed and replied, "Well, I have a small storage room in the basement under this building. I could put him there for a while until he comes to." Megan nodded and offered to help. Together, they carefully lifted the unconscious Carlos and dragged him through the park. Then, passing the courtyard, they finally reached the semi-basement room where the janitor lived. In the cramped, musty room, there was only a table, a chair, and an old bed. The janitor laid Carlos down and covered him with a tattered blanket. "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on him. If he gets worse, I'll call a doctor," he reassured, intercepting Carlos's worried glance. Megan left the storage room with a heavy heart. For some reason, the image of the drunk vagabond still lingered in her mind. She felt sorry for this young man who had hit rock bottom. In the end, she decided to come back here the next day to find out what happened to Carlos and if there was anything she could do to help. Spending a total of about an hour and a half on this adventure, Megan hurried home, where Eric was waiting for her, completely unaware that everything could take so long. But when she opened the door to the apartment, she almost bumped into two unfamiliar men who were busy in the living room. "Eric, what's going on here?" Megan exclaimed in surprise. "I don't know," the little one replied, bewildered. "I was playing in my room, and then suddenly these men came and said they came to take Grandma's apartment." Megan frowned. It was a complete surprise to her. "And may I ask who you are?" she asked, addressing the strangers. "We're appraisers," the older one replied dryly. "We've come to assess this apartment as collateral for a loan taken out by your husband, Charles." "But my husband didn't mention any loan," she exclaimed. "And besides, this apartment belongs to his mother, my mother-in-law." "We can't comment on that," the appraiser cut her off. "Our task is to conduct an assessment and prepare a report." Megan felt like she was losing ground. What was she supposed to do now? On the other hand, she couldn't allow her mother-in-law to be evicted from the house. "Please, give me some time," Megan pleaded. "I need to talk to the owner of the apartment." "Fine. You have exactly 2 days to tidy up the place," the appraiser said more gently. "And then we'll come back again." Megan escorted them out and hugged her son. "Everything will be fine, buddy," she said with a trembling voice. "Mom will figure it out." Although in reality, Megan's heart was torn apart by worry and uncertainty. What was she supposed to do? Megan called her husband. He didn't answer. So she sent him several voice messages, but Charles never called back. The anxiety grew with each passing minute. Not knowing how to get out of this situation, she decided to call the bank that had issued the loan to her husband. Deep down, Megan hoped to get more information and possibly find a way to pay off the debt. But the bank informed her that the loan was taken out for large investments that Charles made without her knowledge. The amount of debt was several million. Megan knew neither she nor her mother-in-law had that kind of money, so she felt betrayed and devastated. She couldn't believe that the person she was planning to build her future with just yesterday would treat her so cruelly. Moreover, Charles hurt his own mother even more by depriving the poor elderly woman of her home. Yeah, looks like Darlene picked him up at the cemetery for nothing. Although, how could she know her son would turn out to be such a scoundrel, Megan thought. At the same time, she almost forgot about her inheritance, consisting of an oil mill and a small stable in the suburbs. Realizing that her mother-in-law's apartment would most likely be taken away, Megan began to think about what to do next. She didn't have a parental home because it burned down 5 years ago due to a fire that started for some strange reason. The firefighters who put out the fire blamed faulty wiring. But Megan knew very well that her mother had replaced it just a year before. It was strange, to say the least. It was a good thing Charles had the house insured back then. It was like he had some kind of epiphany. Suddenly, it dawned on Megan. Wait, insurance. Did Charles pull off another scam back then? How could he have known the house would burn down? Especially since he chose the maximum level of insurance, guaranteeing him a hefty sum. Megan pressed her fingers to her temples. God, how could she have tied her life to this scoundrel? There's no place to put any more stamps on him. It turns out, this wasn't his first scam, and now Charles decided to take his own mother's house away. It's just unthinkable. Megan's mood was completely ruined. Not knowing what to do next, she decided to see how things would unfold. The rest of the day passed in agonizing anticipation. Sensing her mother's anxiety, Eric behaved quietly and hardly misbehaved at all. He was always a modest boy. And after what happened in the morning, he was especially subdued. In the evening, sitting with a cup of tea in the kitchen, Megan for some reason remembered her recent acquaintance, Carlos. How is he? Is everything okay with him? And why doesn't he remember what happened to him? Although, it's not surprising, really. Especially considering he might have consumed some sort of substitute. That same evening, Megan called the nurse on duty at the hospital to inquire about Darlene's condition. Fortunately, everything was fine. Her mother-in-law took the medicine and was already fast asleep. Megan breathed a sigh of relief. Well, at least something is working out, because it seems like a continuous black streak wherever you look. Struggling to wait for morning, she asked her neighbor to look after Eric and went to the park, where she found the janitor sitting on the bench. Seeing her again, he was very surprised. I was just about to go look for you, James Ray said. Carlos woke up, but he only wants to talk to you. My name is James. You can just call me James. We didn't really get properly acquainted yesterday. I'm Megan. Megan Barton, she replied and obediently followed. Carlos lay on the edge of the bed looking embarrassed. Megan, is that you? The man exclaimed in surprise, trying to sit up from the cot. God, my head hurts. Carlos, are you feeling any better? She asked. Seems like it, he replied with difficulty. Megan hesitated. Today, sober, Carlos looked even less like a vagrant than he did yesterday. Someone gave me a ride to the park, Carlos recalled with difficulty. Dropped me off, but it seems they stole my documents before that. So, you're not a vagrant? Megan asked skeptically. No, of course not, Carlos shook his head. I'm an insurance agent. Came for a case, but it seems I was poisoned. And I've partially lost my memory. An insurance agent? She asked again. Then why were you in such a state? Long story, Carlos grimaced, rubbing his temple. Last thing I remember, I was walking somewhere. But I managed to reach people. And that's where you helped me. Megan involuntarily felt a chill. Suddenly, she realized what had happened. Yesterday, she saved a man who was investigating an insurance case. And the criminal, unwilling to pay out the insurance, decided to get rid of the persistent agent. But who could do this to you? Do you remember what he looked like? Megan asked anxiously. Carlos shook his head. No. I honestly didn't pay much attention to his face, but I remember he told me his name. He said his name was Charles. Charles Barton. Megan was nearly overwhelmed with shock. What did you say? Barton? Are you sure? It was Charles, she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. Carlos, as if reading her thoughts, nodded in agreement. Yes, I'm sure. At first, he just seemed like someone trying to escape punishment. But then I realized I was dealing with a very dangerous animal who would stop at nothing to carry out his plans. Megan's heart raced furiously. She couldn't fathom that her wrong and unsuccessful husband, Charles, with whom she shared her life, was capable of such dreadful things. Gathering her strength, she confessed to Carlos that Charles was her spouse. Carlos only shook his head and winced again from the pain in his temples. Calm down, Megan. I will protect you. At this point, he paused, then continued. I've already contacted my colleagues. We will keep an eye on your husband and try to find evidence of his new crimes. But for now, I think you need to leave his mother's house. I understand you're living there right now? Megan, unsure of what to do next, merely nodded weakly. She realized that her life would now change drastically. And that meant there was no going back to the past. Tears streamed down her cheeks. What was all this for? Deceiving her husband, her mother-in-law's illness, and now this, the status of a criminal's wife. She might as well be locked up in town. People would whisper behind her back and point fingers. Lord, how different it was many years ago when she was teased with scarecrows and mannequins. And now, she'd probably be given a worse nickname. Carlos, on the other hand, felt much better. Apparently, the poisoner from Charles didn't do so well. Either he miscalculated the dose, or Carlos's body was stronger than he thought. On the same day, the insurance agent assembled a team of the best investigators among his colleagues. Carlos also shared all the details of the case with them, emphasizing the need to act very, very cautiously. The insurance company employees murmured in agreement. Frankly, they were uncomfortable remembering that Charles had tried to poison their colleague to cover up his crimes. While Carlos and his team worked on their action plan, Megan moved with her son to his home for safety. All this time, she tried to calm herself, remembering the good times she had with Charles. But she couldn't imagine Charles as a heartless criminal. She anxiously awaited a call from Carlos, eager to learn anything about the progress of the investigation. Truth be told, Charles never thought he would be exposed, so he was absolutely sure he had done everything so cleverly that no one would suspect him of insurance fraud. But Carlos's pursuit shocked him to the core and drove him to extreme measures, resorting to poisoning. As it turned out, thanks to the publicity caused by Carlos's poisoning, Charles was apprehended in the shortest possible time. Moreover, his lover, Sherry, immediately distanced herself from everything she knew about the case. However, they didn't pursue her, as it was Charles who drugged the insurance agent during their meeting at the cafe. And Charles also had on his conscience the fact that he dressed the unconscious man in rags and left him to die in the park. But Carlos survived against all odds and was now ready to settle the score with the cunning fraudster for everything he had done. Ironically, Charles, without even wanting it, got divorced much earlier than planned. Moreover, he was now willing to grovel just so Megan wouldn't withdraw her support. After the incident with Darlene's apartment and the appraiser, Charles could no longer rely on Darlene's help, as she disowned him as her son. Fortunately, they managed to keep the apartment, and once again, Megan helped Carlos, who proved the illegality of such a deal. The bank's management didn't dare to oppose the increasingly influential insurance agent in court and back down. Essentially, the money returned to the bank after Charles's property was confiscated, so the incident was settled. After the trial with Charles, Megan filed for divorce and returned to her own home. However, now not only with Eric but also with Carlos, whom she considered her guardian angel. It's worth mentioning that Megan did eventually refuse her late uncle's inheritance, instead giving it to the janitor James, who was passionate about horses and had long dreamed of having his own stable. And where there are horses, an oil mill wouldn't go amiss. As for Darlene, she found out about her son's arrest only after being discharged from the hospital. Truth be told, All this time she had been waiting for Megan or Charles to finally take her apartment away and send her to the home for the elderly to spend her days in the walls of a place foreign to her. Nurses said that in a fit of anxiety, Darlene even asked the doctors to discharge her later to postpone her departure to the nursing home. But when her daughter-in-law personally picked her up from the hospital and brought her to the apartment where cosmetic repairs had been made, the elderly woman couldn't hold back her tears. Embracing Megan, Darlene quietly cried, calling her daughter. Perhaps this is female happiness. Late, coming at the sunset of life, but no less pleasant and desirable. Something to live for, not only to witness Megan and Carlos's wedding, but also to attend the engagement of her grandson Eric. And to embrace true old age surrounded by great-grandchildren. Moreover, Darlene also had a passion for horses, and she often took her grandson with her to visit James on weekends.